Boardroom Bound, episode 158, Leveraging a Healthcare Background in the Boardroom with Howard Lyons.
So I would say develop a passion because it really will show through. So that passion and that enjoyment that you get from following your passion means other people notice it, and it means that it's not like work. It's like following your favorite hobby.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's show, we'll be speaking with my friend Howard Lyons. Howard and I worked together back when I lived in the UK in my management consulting days, and he was a specialist in the healthcare industry. He has grown up in that, has spent his entire career there, continually moving up the path in different companies, from working in the government sector to running hospitals to working in management consulting industry, helping healthcare companies, and he became an expert in operational management, business planning, and strategic healthcare sector reform. And because of that, he eventually got placed into a brand new position in the entire UK, brought together sort of three departments where he was building UK expertise and sharing that with companies and countries across the world. And because of that, he became an incredibly sought after person for public company boards. They were already nonprofits. They were after him. But because of this position, his authority, his expertise was well known. So Howard's going to walk us through that story, how that came about, what it means for him, how he thinks about finding boards, what his due diligence is like, having that abundance mentality, knowing he will have opportunities. So this is a great case study to understand what we can all go through in our careers, how we can position ourselves for our success, and how we should think about balancing a potential portfolio of roles, because those board positions take up a lot of time. Excited to introduce you to my friend, Howard Lyons.
Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBDC-D. And now let's jump into the show.
Howard Lyons, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Great, it's nice to be with you.
Well, it's a pleasure for me. We worked together. It almost feels like a lifetime ago, back when I lived in Europe, working in my management consulting days. And we were on that project, especially in Dubai, where we worked for 6 months or so together. It was great fun. And it's a pleasure for me to sort of share your story with my listeners. And I love how you were this subject matter expert in the space, and you've leveraged that as a position of authority and built out your portfolio board roles from that. And I would love maybe if you could just introduce people to how your sort of career was successful in sort of the managing aspect, and then we'll move on from there about how you then turned that into board positions.
Sure, and if you don't mind, I go back to the beginning because I know you're a Christian college, and that thrills me to know that you're a leading academic institution in the States that is encouraging Christians in business. My start in my career in healthcare came because I originally wanted to be a missionary. So I was converted at university many, many years ago, and I asked the Lord what he wanted me to do, and I asked the church, and at the time I wanted to go off to Nigeria and be a missionary, but the missionary organization said, well, you need to have a profession. You need to have some expertise that we can use. Well, I didn't want to be an accountant at that stage. I didn't want to be a teacher. And a friend of mine told me about the healthcare management program that is run by the business school here. And I applied for that, and I was accepted, and I started my career in healthcare management back in the early 70s, and I've never regretted it. I was able, by being on the national scheme, to get fast-tracked into chief exec of a London teaching hospital within 7-8 years. So I was chief exec of a hospital known as Chelsea and Westminster Hospital in central London. But then I felt I'd gone as far as I could go in the public sector and started to look at the private sector. And I got some former colleagues who'd started to work in the Middle East, and I joined a company that was managing hospitals in the Middle East. So I went out and I managed a hospital in Saudi Arabia, and then I got into consulting from that. And then I had a bit of a crisis after about 15 years in this, and thought, well, I'm now running hospitals. Have I gone as far as I can? And I started to look at alternatives, and one alternative was broadcasting. And there was an international organisation called FIBA, Far East Broadcasting Association, that shares the gospel around the world, based in the Seychelles. And I applied to them, got a job as their overseas international director. And I came back, talked to my church elders, and they said, well, why are you giving up all that expertise you've got in healthcare to go into something that you don't know much about? And I listened to their advice and thought about it, and I decided I would stay in healthcare, and at the same time set up an organisation, which is the first way I got into the charitable sector as a director. I set up an organisation called Christians in Healthcare, which still exists today. And that opened the door later on to other charitable organisations. But at the same time, I changed tack in my career to work as managing director of a private healthcare company. I went in as a director of consulting, then became managing director, and we were managing hospitals around the world, in Middle East in particular, but also Kenya. We ran the National Hospital in Kenya, out in Macau, in Hong Kong, and I really felt fulfilled by that. But it was a private company, and I knew I'd never, ever get a stake in it. It was a family-run business, and so after that I started to look at how I could get into other organizations that I could actually own, and that I could have a part of. So effectively I set up my own company, which was in those days London International Healthcare, and started to get consulting business around the world, doing what I'd done at IHG. And then, part of the story where you come in, that company was acquired by PA Consulting. They bought out my company, and I became a partner in PA Consulting, and then worked with them on the Dubai project, set up their Middle East project. And all was going well until, unfortunately, in God's providence, I contracted bowel cancer, and I had to come back for a very serious operation, and I left PA. But that made me think again about how God is moving in all this, and I had started to get involved through Christians in Healthcare with the Medical Missionary Association, with Christian Medical Fellowship. I facilitated the merger between those two and became a director on the board of Christian Medical Fellowship, which I still am today. Tomorrow we have our annual general meeting. It's 70 years since we started, and then the following day I'm due to leave for Indonesia for the International Christian Medical Dental Association, where I've just been appointed as the UK representative on that board. So that's the sweep from university days through to where I am now. My last job was working for the government, and it was for me, in a sense, God's confirmation that the career path I'd taken was of His calling and His choosing, because I was the first managing director of Healthcare UK, which was basically funded by the NHS, the Department of Health, and also the Department for International Trade, to help share British healthcare expertise in the emerging markets of China, India, Middle East, and Latin America. And I did that for first 3 years, and then we successfully won business of about £5 billion, that's about $7 billion, and then I retired. And that was, I thought, the end of my career. I'd reached 65, and that was going to be it. But then I took a gap year, and people came and approached me about non-exec positions. So I did some research on it. I joined a non-executive directors organization in the UK, which I think is known as In Touch in the US. They were very helpful in sending opportunities my way. And then I was approached by an organization that I'd helped quite a lot in establishing their project in India. And I'm now chairman of the UK Global Health Care, or also known as the Indo-UK Institute of Health, which is building 11 medicities across India. So that's why I've become a little busier again, because that's a massive undertaking. But in preparation for that, I made sure that I joined the Institute of Directors here, that I went on their training courses, making sure that I was up to date and up to speed for what is likely to be a £10 billion company. So I think that's enough on from start to finish, but that's where I am today.
So that was a great soup to nuts overview. There's so much for us that we can unpack on there, and I appreciate that. So, for example, we'll come back to In Touch. I mean, we've got a great episode with their CEO, Matt, was on the podcast as well. But it's interesting how you went down a path. It sounded almost like by chance. Like, okay, healthcare sounds like a good way to start, but you built a reputation, you built a platform of expertise and authority, and we've talked about that before. Episode 17 with Matt Craven, we talked about how no generalists are appointed to boards. You need to be a specialist. It could be in an industry, it could be a function, but you have a clear sense of exactly what you bring to the table. So much so, Howard, that you were an expert on that people were approaching you to be on board. So as you moved and advanced in that, and it's fascinating to feel in your story, and I'd love your feedback on this. You talked about how you sort of began as a director almost by accident, by setting up some nonprofits. You thought, okay, I have these experiences, but you hadn't planned to pursue a portfolio of board roles, right?
That's right, and that really only came about effectively after I retired, because I thought then, especially having helped British organisations to win business in these emerging markets in China and India, etc., I did get approached by people and saying, will you come and join us as a non-exec? So I started to realise that there was an opportunity to continue to contribute, but without having the stress that all CEOs know and managing directors know of the day-to-day responsibility. So the non-exec role appealed to me. I didn't really want to become chairman of such a large organisation, but again, that's a non-executive chairmanship, which I think is different from what is the norm in the United States. I think we're more likely in the UK to have a non-executive chairman and an executive vice president or senior vice president or overall chief exec, whereas here I don't have the day-to-day responsibility. My responsibility is exercised through chairing the board, through chairing the nominations subcommittee, and basically keeping in regular contact with the chief exec on the critical fundraising expedition that we're on at the moment, trying to raise this $10 billion that we need.
It's a wonderful point, because I would argue that there are very few people, if any, in the world who should be both CEO and chairman, because the responsibilities are both huge in and of themselves. And you could also argue it's hard to do one well without compromising on the other. There are some people who maybe do it really well, Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, for example, but there is beginning to slowly become more realization in the U.S. that for real reasons we should change those out. So often what you'll see in a board, if the CEO is both the chairman, there will be a lead independent director who's a very strong strong voice, and what they'll be telling the activists, the investors, is this person is really sort of that, like you talked about, that number two, that vice president, a vice chair who's trying to be that other voice. But for you, this is really fascinating to think about, because there's often two paths we talk about in this show. There are people that are in sort of the senior business executive roles who are beginning to move into the board space at the same time because they have that platform. And there are others who are following the path that you've gone down of thinking, well, I will maybe have just had experience intentionally or not, and then when I retire and have more time, I'll pursue board roles. And I'd love to unpack that a bit more with you. So clearly you were alluding to it there, but let's take it into more detail. For many people, being in the C-suite is really tough job in and of itself. And the idea of taking on a board role, and in addition to that, and it can vary whether it's a for-profit or a non-profit, but maybe you can give us, for some of our audience, what that actually looks and feels like. What is your commitment? You're on multiple boards today. If someone's thinking, you know what, I can be in my business job, but also take on board roles in addition, maybe you can throw some cold water on that for us.
Oh, yeah. When I was in an executive position, the only non-executive roles I took were on charities like Christian Medical Fellowship, like Christar, which you may know. I was a deacon in the church. Those were all non-executive areas of responsibility, because the main job, the day job, the one that earned all the money, was just full on, as it is for all MDs and CEOs. I feel having, in my last year at Healthcare UK, I found I travelled to 20 different countries, and not just a day at a time, but a week or so. And I found that as I was growing older, much more stressful, and that's why I just stopped completely and stopped to think about it all. And I think the idea of taking on non-exec roles now means I can be selective. I can do my research. I tend to do it for people that I know, organizations that I respect, and in areas that I'm passionate about. And I think you can't underestimate that idea that you do things that you're passionate about. I don't need to do it for the money. Fortunately, I've got a good pension. So money is not the chief consideration. The main thing is doing what you want to do. If you're somebody who's seeking to move into non-executive roles on boards, I think you really ought to focus your main attention on doing your day job really well and going as far as you can in your day job before you start to think about doing non-executive jobs at the same time, unless it's in the not-for-profit sector with NGOs or with charities, or if you're going to get the experience you need to set up your own business. I mean, I know the United States has got a reputation for being a lot more entrepreneurial than the UK. So people have a mindset, probably from graduation, if not before, of going into their own business. And therefore, if you're already doing well in your career, then to take a non-exec role, if you can, will help you understand what it's going to be like to run your own business at some point, and how you then build into your business the kind of non-execs that you need to be able to guide you to make your business a success.
Howard, I love a couple of the points you made there. And first, I would echo, you talked about something that you're passionate about, is because you can be selective today. That's where you will invest your time. I think everybody is well served if boards take up a lot of time, whether it's a charity or obviously for-profit takes up more. But if you have a passion for what the business is, what the charity is, I think you bring your best self there, and it also represents you well, and it probably builds a platform for other opportunities. But I'm hoping you could also unpick into a little more detail for us what you talked about. Another part, you said you now have the opportunity to be selective and you can do your research. We give the advice of due diligence is incredibly important, because you want to make sure you're putting yourself into a good position. Not only the company is a good footing, but the other people on the board are a good footing. Perhaps you could share with the audience sort of your personal stories about when you get approached. Let's say there's a new for-profit company who's coming to you today, say, Howard, you're a perfect fit for us. We'd love to have you, give you a seat and join. What's that due diligence like for you? How do you actually go about it?
Yeah, there was one that came up last year that is a new wound care company. And they felt that I got really good contacts in the public sector in the UK, and they thought I could be really helpful in getting them to undertake trials of their wound care products in the UK and then internationally. I was probably more interested in the international rollout because that's where I felt my up-to-date knowledge of markets would have been helpful to them. But they also had a subsidiary company that was involved in what is a legitimate business, but it just didn't feel something that I wanted to get involved in. And it was basically with penile implants and with helping men who are fearful about their virility. And I just didn't feel that was the kind of association I wanted, even though the wound care looked a great product and something that I could contribute to. But they were pressing me because it looked like they were ready to get substantial funding. And interestingly, on the day I had to decide, I went to see the chief executive of Christian Medical Fellowship, who I knew had just been offered a job chairing chief exec of the ICMDA, the international body. And I thought he just wanted to tell me about his moving on. But he didn't. He said, I'd like you to consider whether you could come onto the international board as a UK representative. And it was one of those aha moments. I just thought, this is perfect timing from the Lord to show me that I should pursue something that I've got a passion in, which is international healthcare, rather than something that I can contribute to, but which may, in some ways, not necessarily be best for my reputation or best for the kind of business that is associated alongside the wound care business. So I thought it over for a couple of days, went back and I've joined the board of ICMDA, which is not paid, and I went back to the other people and said, I'm sorry, I don't think I should take this on, and that was a bit awkward for a time. But basically they've now moved on, and I'm sure they're progressing happily without me. But I'm now really enthusiastic about the work of ICMDA, working with the new chief exec and thinking, wow, that really fits in with what God has trained me in, the experiences I've had over the last 20, 30 years. And so I'm really looking forward to the upcoming board meetings, and they've asked me to speak at a leadership conference, and it's just exactly what I feel I've been qualified to do.
And I suppose one of the things that you have now that I encourage everyone to have is an abundance mentality, a recognition that I have a certain skill set. You've actually seen people approach you. So being selective, I don't know if I want to say it's easy, right? Because if someone's offering you a paid board role, but you know it's the right thing to do and it's a way to go about it. And you've probably got that just by, it's an unconscious reaction now of like, okay, it's okay if I pass on this. Other things will pop up.
Yeah. Well, I knew that retiring from a government position where I've been involved taking ministers to different countries, meeting with ministers of health and senior government officials, that I had contacts and current networks that people in the private sector would want to make use of. And I thought, well, I'm not sure if that's what I want to do. That's why I took the gap year. But during that gap year, just taking 1 year out after formal retirement, I did join In Touch or Ned on Board, and they sent me prospects virtually every day in the healthcare sector. And I looked at them and I explored them. I occasionally went to meet with headhunters because that gave me an opportunity to think, rather than people coming to me, these are organizations that I could apply to through headhunters or whatever and make a contribution that way. At the end of the year, I didn't actually take up anything that come through Ned on Board, through non-executive directors, and I did end up going back to join two companies, one in China and one working in India, that I'd helped during my time at Healthcare UK. But there were people I knew, people I trusted, and I felt the fit was right, rather than taking something new that came to me from from the market, if you like, that came through Net on Board.
And you've made a couple of great points there that I'd love to touch upon. So that you're one about you bring not only an expertise in an area, a position of authority, but the idea that you have key government contacts. And we've heard about this story before. So the episode with Paul Comfort, where he was the head of the transportation for the larger Baltimore area. And he talked about the amazing contacts he had in the government and the roles that opened up for him because of that. And you're also echoing that. And I think there's a clear recognition for people that in the business world, some businesses have lots of interaction with government. So for people who have worked in government, we had in a previous episode, Jesse St. Cyr, who had worked in Massachusetts key senior government roles and was so highly sought after because of her network that it was a very valuable piece. And so I would also encourage our audience to recognize it's not just the business world experience you need. It's not just those contacts you need in other areas of space. And it's clearly the episode that we're talking about with you today, Howard, shares that for other people as well.
Well, I think the role I had in government was something that other people could make good use of, because essentially we were using government funds to take people to markets. And that was helping private companies as well as public sector companies that were interested in working overseas. We took them right in. We were door openers, and we got them right in at the highest level. We also did the research for them. We did the background checks. And although my office was relatively small, I had about 40 people working for me in London, we had the advantage of working with British embassies all over the world, and they would have good knowledge, good contacts. Now that's something that I've been able to maintain, so that even with this Indian project, I was able to contact only a couple of days ago the ambassador in a Middle East country where funding is being raised for this project, to ask him if he could help over the Eid holiday, because during the Eid holiday, officials from the government mix with the locals, and you can just have conversations there that help move the project along. So yes, having good government contacts is vital for many private sector companies. It eases their market entry, and it also saves them a lot of time by giving them shortcuts and market intelligence.
And so, Howard, it's very clear from this episode you've had a very successful career. You've done really well. You're now positioned that people are approaching, seeing the value you can add. And it's not just on this episode we're talking about your success. So I'm going to give you that humble brag for a minute. So this is what I loved when my 7 years in the UK, of the different sort of three letters that can follow people's name because they've been honored by the Queen on her various lists. So you are CBE, the Commander of the Order of the British Empire. And we talk about credentials over here in the US. You'll see MBA or JD or CPA or CFA. People love to put those behind. In the UK, I imagine these three letters really stand out to people, as well as a certification, as a credential that show that other people have recognized you as a position. We talk a lot on this show about how do you make yourself stand out? How do you make your candidacy sticky? I imagine something like that, and it's on your LinkedIn profile, for example. It must be something that helps you. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it really was a great honor and unexpected. I mean, I basically retired. And then, in fact, the letter was sent to the wrong place. My secretary, who was still there, found the letter, opened it, and called me. And at the time, I was with my wife looking at a new property on the Isle of Wight, and I was at the top of the garden. And one of the things it says in the letter, because it's a month before it's actually announced, is don't tell anyone. So the letter came in, and my wife came up to me and she said, "Who are you talking to?" So I said, "My secretary." "What were you talking about?" "Well, I can't say." We had a very frosty moment for a little while. I did actually tell her, but I didn't tell my children. I didn't tell anybody else until the day when it's announced on the Queen's birthday here. And then it's just an amazing outpouring of friendship from people who write to you and congratulate you and say, whether it's well earned or whatever. But it does have status and kudos in this country. And though I was by then retired, so probably not as able to make good use of it, it certainly helps when when people are talking to me about joining their company. Sometimes think they probably only want me for the CBE rather than for any natural knowledge or understanding that I've got.
Well, along those lines, if we try to summarize up a lot of this amazing value today and through your career experiences, people I'm sure have taken nuggets away that they can use as they go forward. If we were to step back and try and give a parting piece of advice, if someone was saying, great, how do I follow in your footsteps? What would you give as someone the piece of advice that if they were seeking their first paid board role would be the most important thing to do?
Well, I think going back to what we said earlier, I think quite a lot of your students, for example, are doing the Masters in Finance. And my first year in health service management was on the finance scheme. And finance, I think, is a real door opener. But it may be that finance is not necessarily your passion. It's a means to an end. So I would say develop a passion, because it really will show through. And it can get you on, finance can get you onto boards, especially the NGOs, but that passion and that knowledge that you build up. I mean, I had my crisis after 15 years thinking whether I should go into broadcasting, and I'm delighted that I didn't, because the next 20 years after that, I just kept building on it and building on it, by which time people were saying, well, nobody's worked in 70 countries in healthcare, so we want you. And nobody knows what's going on in China as well as you do, because you've been there 40, 50 times. And it just accumulates. So that passion and that enjoyment that you get from following your passion means other people notice it. And it means that it's not like work. It's like following your favorite hobby. So that would be my piece of advice. Seek the Lord's guidance in it, and talk to your church as well. See what they say, but basically follow your passion. And I think the other side to it, although I was looking late in life, and probably a lot of your audience are looking at this much earlier on, it really was helpful to join the Institute of Directors here. You probably have an equivalent in the US, and to go on a course just to make sure I was fully up to speed with the UK governance arrangements. I think knowing that gives you a lot of confidence. And even today, while I was getting ready to speak to you, Alexander, an In Touch invitation came in which said the 15 questions that you'll probably be asked when you apply for a non-executive director post. So I looked at it and I thought, well, fortunately, I know most of the answers to those questions. But, for people who are looking for their first one, I would say go on a course, join up with In Touch, but also follow your contacts, because getting that first one, it's like in hospital management. You're not allowed to manage a hospital until you managed a hospital. It's the old catch-22. Right. Can't be a non-executive director till you've been a non-executive director. So if you've got a contact, a friend who knows what you're worth and what your commitment is and your passion, that's an easier way than just cold calling or just writing off and applying for non-executive positions, I would say.
Right, that makes sense. And in the U.S., it's the National Association of Corporate Directors, NACD, and we've had their CEO, Peter Gleason, on for episode 24, where you just hear about all the amazing opportunities, which in some ways educates you, but it also gives you another bow in your quiver that helps you stand out a bit, and sort of like the CBA experience, saying you are someone with that credential and quality. And Howard, I think your point about passion is very clear. We can tell this is exactly where your skill set and your interests align in the healthcare space, and how it's been a boon for you as you go forward. And thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your passion for what you're doing with all of us. We were delighted to hear from you today, and we appreciate the insights that you helped all of our audience to be more boardroom bound. That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Howard Lyons, and it was great to hear how his story grew from being very successful and an authority in the healthcare space to becoming someone sought after for board roles, and how he has gone about building that and leveraging his connections and being involved in certification programs and sharing his knowledge, and how all of that came together for him to build that board role. And this is a great case study for a lot of our listeners to think, how do I position myself, whether it's tomorrow or next year or in a few years? What do I need to do to hone my message and then to share my message so that it becomes very attractive to others? Now remember, we talked about a lot of resources in today's show, so you're going to want to head over to podcast.gordon.edu to find the links. And of course, the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we bring to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.